Her billionaire husband framed her for murder to protect his mistress. She served 18 months before the truth emerged. The day she walked free was the day his empire collapsed overnight, and she never looked back. If you think about leaving after reading the title, don't. I promise this will be the best story of your life. Don't miss Chapter 9. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Hushed Stories. May the Almighty wrap every woman in a protection so strong that no lie can destroy her. And bless her with a truth so powerful it shatters every chain meant to bind her. May her heart be guarded with courage, her steps guided by justice, and her spirit lifted with a strength that can topple empires built on deceit. Women are the unbreakable forces of this world. They survive betrayal, rise from ashes, and still choose to love again without limits. I pray that every woman who hears this finds days filled with vindication, nights covered in peace, and a future overflowing with the justice she deserves. May every lie told about her turn into her testimony, every prison door open become her platform, and every prayer she whispers be answered in ways more devastating to her enemies than she imagined. May her innocence be proven, her name cleared, and her soul forever protected by truth's unshakable hands. If your heart believes in justice, like the video. If you stand with the wrongfully accused, write, I am with Nancy Reynolds. Nancy Reynolds heard the word guilty and realized that the man she'd built an empire with for 14 years had just chosen his murderous mistress over the truth, and there was nothing left in her chest where her heart used to be. The courtroom swam before her eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had once gazed at priceless art in galleries across Manhattan, now staring at the cold reality of a rigged system. Judge Anna Folk's voice continued, mechanical and distant, something about premeditated murder and the severity of taking Catherine Wu's life. 15 years. The words landed like stones in water, disappearing into a depth Nancy couldn't measure. 5,475 days. She tried to count them, but her mind went blank. Her legs trembled beneath her tailored charcoal dress, the Armani one Melvin had bought her last Christmas, saying it made her look like the art she curated, timeless and invaluable. She'd worn it today because some stupid part of her thought it mattered what she looked like when they declared her innocent. She'd even done her makeup carefully this morning in the holding cell, hands shaking as she applied the deep berry lipstick Melvin once said was his favorite, wanting to look composed and dignified for the camera she'd assumed would capture her vindication, for the moment when the jury would see she couldn't possibly have strangled a woman she'd never met. What a fool. Behind her, her sister Salmon gasped, a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. Nancy's attorney Stacey E. Williams was already gathering papers with shaking hands, whispering something about appeals, about fighting this, but Nancy couldn't hear her over the roaring in her ears. She turned, searching for Melvin in the gallery. He sat 3 rows back, perfectly still in his charcoal Tom Ford suit, the one he'd worn to their last anniversary dinner at Mistress. His face was a mask of careful neutrality, no tears, no shock, no horror at watching his wife of 14 years convicted of murder. Just cold, practiced composure. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Nancy saw it clearly for the first time, calculation. He'd known. He'd always known. The prosecution had built their case on lies wrapped in expensive packaging. Lisa Manfredi, Melvin's mistress, a woman Nancy hadn't even known existed until 3 months ago, had taken the stand 2 days earlier, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. She'd claimed Nancy threatened Catherine Wu at a charity gala, that Nancy was obsessed with destroying Melvin's business rivals, that she'd heard Nancy on the phone making violent threats. All fiction. All delivered with the trembling voice of a concerned citizen just trying to do the right thing. Then came Melvin's testimony, the knife that cut deepest. He'd sat in that witness box, his hand on the Bible, and called his wife unstable. He'd described her as jealous, increasingly erratic, someone he'd grown to fear. He spoke about finding her access card missing the night Catherine Wu died, about Nancy's obsessive personality, about her capacity for violence when she felt threatened. The jury had hung on every word, watching the billionaire tech mogul struggle with the painful truth about his dangerous wife. Except none of it was true. The forensic evidence was worse. Nancy's DNA under Catherine's fingernails. Her access card used to enter the building where Catherine's body was found. Security footage showing someone in Nancy's coat leaving the scene. Her car, the white Mercedes Melvin had given her for their 10th anniversary, used to transport the body. Nancy had been at a gallery opening that night. She had witnesses. She had time-stamped photographs standing next to the mayor at 9:47 p.m., the exact time the prosecution claimed she was strangling Catherine Wu in a hotel room across town. But somehow, none of it mattered against the mountain of physical evidence. Physical evidence that she now understood had been planted. Manufactured. Bought. Judge Folk's gavel cracked like thunder. The defendant will rise for sentencing. Nancy stood on legs that no longer felt like her own. Stacy gripped her elbow, steadying her. Nancy Reynolds, you have been found guilty of murder in the first degree. This court sentences you to 15 years in the state correctional facility, with eligibility for parole after serving a minimum of 12 years. This crime was particularly heinous, a calculated act of violence against a successful businesswoman whose only crime was professional rivalry. You will be remanded into custody immediately. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, the metal cold against Nancy's wrists. The click of the lock sounded like a door slamming shut on her entire life. Everything she'd built, her career as one of Manhattan's most respected art curators, her reputation, her freedom, her identity, gone in the space between one heartbeat and the next. As they led her toward the side door, Nancy looked back one final time. Melvin remained motionless in his seat, watching her with those dark eyes she'd once thought held love. Lisa sat beside him now, her hand resting on his arm, her tears conveniently dried. The woman Nancy had supposedly attacked out of jealous rage, the mistress she hadn't known existed, now comforting Nancy's husband in his moment of difficult truth-telling. In that moment, something inside Nancy Reynolds died. Not hope, hope had died weeks ago during the trial. Not love, love had shattered the moment Melvin took that witness stand and lied under oath. What died was softer, more fundamental. It was the belief that truth mattered, that justice existed, that the man she'd spent 14 years loving had ever been real at all. The refined art curator who believed in beauty and integrity, who trusted that wealth meant honor, who'd built her life around a man who just destroyed her to protect his empire, that woman was gone. The door closed behind her with a final, echoing bang. Through the small window, Nancy caught one last glimpse of the courtroom. Melvin was already standing, straightening his suit jacket, preparing to face the cameras outside with his prepared statement about how difficult this had been for him, how he'd hoped until the very end that the wife he loved wasn't capable of such violence. Nancy turned away. The bailiff guided her down the corridor toward processing, toward the van that would transport her to the state correctional facility, toward the orange jumpsuit that would replace her Armani dress, toward a cell that would become her home for the next 15 years. She didn't cry. Tears required feeling something, and Nancy felt nothing but the cold certainty that the man she'd built an empire with had just sacrificed her to protect it. 6 months ago, she'd been planning their anniversary gala at the Metropolitan Museum, selecting the perfect Chagall pieces for the exhibition, choosing between the lobster and the sea bass for the dinner menu. Now she was convicted of strangling a woman she'd never met, framed by a mistress she didn't know existed, destroyed by a husband who'd chosen his billions and his beautiful liar over his wife's life. The processing room was sterile and fluorescent bright. They took her fingerprints again, her photograph again, stripped away her jewelry piece by piece. The platinum wedding band Melvin had placed on her finger 14 years ago in St. Patrick's Cathedral, promising forever. The Cartier watch he'd given her when she'd curated her first major exhibition. The diamond studs from their 5th anniversary. Personal effects will be stored until your release, the officer said, her voice neither kind nor cruel, just indifferent. Just doing her job. Then came the orange jumpsuit, coarse and humiliating against skin that had only known silk and cashmere for over a decade. Nancy pulled it on with hands that had stopped shaking, her mind strangely calm now, floating somewhere above her body. They led her to a holding cell to await transport. Through the small barred window, she could see the courthouse steps where Melvin was surely standing right now, giving his statement, Lisa at his side, the grieving husband who'd done everything possible to protect a wife he'd loved despite her darkness. Nancy sat on the metal bench and stared at her hands. These hands had curated exhibitions at the Met, the Guggenheim, the Whitney. These hands had held Melvin's face on their wedding day. These hands had never hurt anyone, had never touched Catherine Wu, had never committed the murder they'd just been convicted of. She looked up at the small window, at the slice of gray November sky visible beyond the bars, and made herself a promise in the silence of that cell. I will survive this. I will discover the truth. And the day I walk free will be the day Melvin Morton loses everything. She didn't know yet that Lisa Manfredi had strangled Catherine Wu to secure a $500 million business deal. She didn't know that Melvin had known within hours and chosen to frame his innocent wife rather than lose his empire. She didn't know that her mother would die while she rotted in prison, or that 18 months from now, both of them would be arrested while she walked free. All Nancy knew, sitting in that holding cell in an orange jumpsuit, was that the woman who'd loved Melvin Morton was dead. And something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous had just been born. Nancy Reynolds had been breathing recycled air and sleeping on a thin mattress for 45 days when she finally understood that her husband hadn't just betrayed her, he'd framed her for murder to protect a killer. The realization came on a Tuesday afternoon in Cell Block C, maximum security, where the fluorescent lights never quite turned off and the smell of industrial cleaner mixed with desperation. Nancy sat cross-legged on her bunk, reading the trial transcripts her attorney had sent, when her cellmate Maria spoke up from the desk where she was reviewing legal briefs. "Your forensic timeline doesn't make sense," Maria said, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Maria Gonzalez had been a corporate lawyer at a White Shoe Manhattan firm before an embezzlement charge, one she swore was fabricated by a vengeful partner, landed her here for 3 years. She had sharp eyes and sharper instincts, and she'd been reviewing Nancy's case with the precision of someone who still thought like an attorney even in orange. Nancy looked up, her blue eyes tired but alert. 45 days had taught her to pay attention when Maria spoke. "What do you mean?" "The prosecution claimed you strangled Catherine Wu at 9:47 p.m. based on time of death estimates. But you have time-stamped photographs at the gallery opening at that exact moment, standing next to the mayor. So they adjusted their timeline, said the murder happened between 9:30 and 10:15, a wider window. But the rigor mortis progression in the autopsy report doesn't support that flexibility. It's sloppy." Nancy set down the transcript, her heart beginning to pound. "My attorney mentioned inconsistencies, but the judge ruled them inadmissible, said the prosecution's expert testimony was sufficient." "Of course she did." Maria's voice was bitter. "Judge Folk has a 94% conviction rate in high-profile cases. She doesn't like looking wrong." She pushed her glasses up and turned to face Nancy fully. "But here's what's bothering me more, why Catherine Wu? What did she have that you supposedly wanted badly enough to kill for?" "The prosecution said I was jealous of Melvin's professional relationships with successful women. That I saw Catherine as a threat to my marriage." "Bullshit." Maria's bluntness still startled Nancy sometimes, even after 45 days of prison talk. Catherine Wu was a venture capitalist, not some young assistant. She was 58 years old, married with grandchildren, and gay. I remember reading about her wife in Forbes. "You're telling me your billionaire husband's mistress convinced a jury you were jealous of a lesbian grandmother?" Nancy felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd been so focused on surviving each day, on the horror of the conviction itself, that she hadn't stepped back to examine the absurdity of the motive. I never thought about it that way." "That's because you're thinking like an innocent person. You're thinking about what you didn't do." Maria stood and crossed the small cell, sitting on Nancy's bunk. "Start thinking about what someone else did do. What did Catherine Wu have that someone wanted?" "She was blocking Melvin's acquisition deal." The words came out of Nancy's mouth before she'd fully formed the thought. "Oh my God. She was blocking the TechVision merger." Maria's eyes sharpened. "Tell me." Nancy's mind raced, pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. Catherine Wu sat on TechVision's board. Melvin wanted to acquire them for $500 million, it would have made him one of the biggest players in AI infrastructure overnight. But Catherine kept voting against the deal, said Morton Tech's ethics violations made them unsuitable partners. She had 3 other board members with her. The deal was dying. And when did Catherine die? 2 weeks before the final board vote. Nancy's voice came out as a whisper. 2 weeks before the vote that would have killed Melvin's biggest acquisition in 5 years. Who benefited from her death? The cell suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. Nancy could barely breathe. Melvin. The deal went through 3 weeks after Catherine died. The board voted 6-2 in favor. I remember because, her voice broke. I remember because I was already in custody, and Salman told me Melvin was celebrating the acquisition while I sat in a cell awaiting trial. I thought he was just a monster moving on with his life. I didn't realize that he killed her. Or had her killed. Maria's voice was gentle but firm. Nancy, who discovered the body? Nancy flipped through the transcript with shaking hands. An anonymous 911 call reported a body in the parking garage. The caller was never identified. Police found Catherine in the trunk of my car. How convenient. And who had access to your car besides you? Melvin. And, Nancy stopped, her blood turning to ice. And Lisa Manfredi. She had the spare key because she sometimes drove it when she was sleeping with my husband in my home. Maria nodded slowly. Now ask yourself, what kind of woman testifies against the wife of her lover? What kind of mistress takes the stand and cries about threats and violence when she's sleeping in that same wife's bed, wearing her jewelry, spending her money? The kind who has something to hide. Nancy's hands were trembling now, the transcript pages fluttering. Maria, what if Lisa killed Catherine? What if she did it for Melvin, to save the deal, and he framed me to protect her? Or they did it together? Maria's voice was quiet but certain. Nancy, I've been practicing corporate law for 20 years before I ended up here. A $500 million acquisition doesn't just matter to the CEO, it matters to everyone in his inner circle who stands to benefit. Board members, executives, major shareholders, and yes, mistresses who might also be business partners. Nancy felt like she was falling, the cell tilting sideways. I need to find out who Lisa Manfredi really is. What her connection to Morton Tech was beyond sleeping with Melvin. You need your sister. Maria stood and moved to the small desk, pulling out a notepad. When's your next visitation? Saturday. Salman comes every week. Good. Because if I'm right, we need to start investigating from the outside while I work the legal angles from in here. And Nancy? Maria turned, her expression serious. If Lisa killed Catherine Wu, and your husband helped frame you for it, they're not going to stop protecting that secret. You need to be very careful about who you trust. Saturday came slowly, each hour stretching like taffy. When the guard finally called Nancy's name for visitation, she nearly ran to the visiting room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Salman sat behind the plexiglass partition, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. She was 2 years younger than Nancy, a corporate accountant with their father's analytical mind and their mother's fierce loyalty. She picked up the phone the moment Nancy sat down. Sal, I need you to investigate Lisa Manfredi. Nancy kept her voice low, aware of guards circulating nearby. Find out everything about her background, her connection to Morton Tech, her role in Melvin's business dealings. And I need you to pull everything you can find about the TechVision acquisition, board minutes, financial filings, everything. Salman's eyes widened. Nancy, what are you thinking? I'm thinking Catherine Wu was murdered to clear the way for a $500 million deal, and I was framed because I was the convenient scapegoat. The jealous wife. The unstable woman who couldn't handle her husband's success. Nancy's voice was steady now, cold with certainty. I need you to prove Lisa Manfredi had motive, means, and opportunity to kill Catherine. Because I think she did it, Sal. I think she strangled Catherine Wu, and Melvin helped her get away with it by sacrificing me. Salman was already pulling out a notebook, her accountant's brain shifting into investigation mode. I'll start with corporate filings, see if Lisa had any official role at Morton Tech. Then I'll work backward through her history. If there's a connection to the TechVision deal, I'll find it. Be careful, Nancy warned. If I'm right, they've already killed once and framed me to protect themselves. They won't hesitate to destroy you too. Let them try. Salman's jaw set in a way Nancy recognized from childhood, her little sister preparing for battle. You didn't kill anyone, Nancy. And I'm going to prove it even if I have to take apart Melvin's entire empire piece by piece. After the visit ended, Nancy returned to cell block C with something she hadn't felt in 45 days, hope. It was fragile and terrifying, mixed with the horrified realization that the man she'd loved had orchestrated her destruction to protect a murderer. But it was there, a small flame in the darkness. Maria looked up when Nancy entered. Well? She's investigating. Nancy sat on her bunk, her mind already racing ahead. Maria, if we're going to prove this, we need more than motive. We need evidence that Lisa was actually there that night, that she had the opportunity to kill Catherine and frame me. Maria smiled grimly. Then it's a good thing I still have friends from my old life who owe me favors. Time to start asking questions. That night, lying on her thin mattress while the prison breathed its industrial sounds around her, Nancy stared at the ceiling and let herself see it clearly for the first time: Lisa Manfredi strangling Catherine Wu in a hotel room, using Nancy's stolen access card, planting evidence, calling Melvin to clean up the scene. Melvin making the decision in seconds: protect the empire, protect the mistress, sacrifice the wife. The refined art curator who believed in love and integrity was dead. But the woman who would dismantle her husband's empire piece by piece, who would expose the murderous mistress and watch them both lose everything, was just beginning to wake up. And she had nothing but time to plan their destruction. 4 months into her sentence, Nancy Reynolds discovered that survival required becoming someone else entirely, and she embraced the transformation with cold, methodical precision. The prison gym became her cathedral. Every morning at 5 a.m., before the breakfast bell rang through cell block C, Nancy was in the weight room doing push-ups until her arms shook, running the track until her lungs burned. The refined art curator who'd done gentle yoga in her penthouse meditation room was gone. In her place, a woman with corded muscle and watchful eyes, someone who understood that physical strength meant respect in this concrete world, and respect meant staying alive long enough to destroy the people who'd put her here. "You're getting hard," Maria observed one evening, watching Nancy do pull-ups on the bar they'd installed in their cell. "Good. Soft doesn't survive in here." Nancy dropped down, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her blue eyes sharp with focus. "I'm not trying to survive. I'm preparing to win." She picked up the legal textbook Maria had acquired through her connections, Evidence and Procedure in Criminal Appeals, and settled onto her bunk. 4 months in, and Nancy had consumed more legal knowledge than some first-year law students. She studied forensics, criminal procedure, corporate law, white-collar crime. Maria tutored her like a professor with a brilliant student, teaching her to think like a lawyer, to see the weaknesses in prosecution theories, to understand how evidence could be manufactured and dismantled. But Nancy's real education came from the network she was building. In prison, information was currency, and Nancy had learned to spend wisely. There was Keisha in D Block, former CFO who'd embezzled millions and understood corporate finance better than most Wall Street analysts. There was Rosa, convicted of conspiracy in her husband's drug operation, who knew how to read people's lies and track money through shell companies. There was Diane, former private investigator now serving time for hacking, who still had contacts on the outside who could dig up information for the right price. Nancy shared her story carefully, strategically. Not the victim's tale the prosecution had sold, but the truth: innocent woman framed by billionaire husband and murderous mistress to protect a business deal. In prison, where most women had been failed by the system in some way, her story resonated. They believed her because they'd seen too many rich men escape justice while women paid the price. "I need to know everything about Lisa Manfredi before she met Melvin," Nancy told Diane during their Thursday yard time. Her real background, her education, where she worked, who she knew. "Everything." Diane nodded, her weathered face calculating. "My guy charges $500 for a deep background check. Can you cover it?" "My father will." Nancy's voice was steady. Alexander M. Reynolds had visited 3 weeks ago, his distinguished face haggard with grief but his resolve unshakable. He'd sat across from her in the visitation room and said, "Tell me what you need, Nancy. Money, lawyers, investigators, whatever it takes. Your mother and I didn't raise you for 32 years to watch you rot in here for a crime you didn't commit." Her mother. Nancy pushed the thought away. Linda Reynolds was fighting stage 3 breast cancer while her daughter fought false murder charges. The cruelty of it sometimes took Nancy's breath away, her mother dying while she was trapped behind bars, unable to hold her hand, unable to say goodbye properly. Every Saturday, Salmon brought updates that felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly taking shape. She'd discovered that Lisa Manfredi wasn't just Melvin's mistress. She'd been hired by Morton Tech 2 years ago as a strategic business consultant, working directly with Melvin on the TechVision acquisition. She'd attended board meetings, conducted due diligence, built relationships with TechVision executives. She'd been embedded in the deal from the beginning. She had everything to lose if that acquisition fell through, Salmon had said last week, her voice tight with controlled rage. Her consulting contract was contingent on successful deal closure, $2 million bonus plus equity in the merged company. Catherine Wu wasn't just blocking Melvin's ambitions, Nancy. She was blocking Lisa's payday. Nancy had felt something dark and fierce unfurl in her chest. Not just motive, financial motive worth killing for. But the worst news came during visitation 3 weeks ago, delivered in Salmon's trembling voice. Lisa moved into the penthouse. She's wearing your clothes, sleeping in your bed, hosting parties with your friends. She posted on Instagram last week, a photo in your Dior gown at some charity gala, standing next to Melvin like she's always been Mrs. Morton. Nancy had gripped the phone so hard her knuckles went white. The penthouse she'd decorated, the home she'd made, now occupied by her husband's mistress, the woman who'd murdered Catherine Wu and framed Nancy to steal it all. The art curator who would have wept at the violation was dead. The woman who remained felt only cold calculation. Good, Nancy had said, her voice like ice. Let her get comfortable. Let her think she's won. It'll make the fall so much more devastating. Now, sitting in her cell with legal textbooks spread around her and Maria reviewing case precedents, Nancy was building something methodical and merciless, the architecture of vengeance. Not the hot, reckless kind that led to mistakes, but cold, strategic destruction. She was learning to think like her enemies, calculating, patient, willing to sacrifice anything for victory. Maria looked up from her notes. I've been going through the witness statements again. There's something off about the hotel security footage the prosecution used. The timestamp format doesn't match the hotel's standard system. Nancy's pulse quickened. You think it was doctored? I think someone with money and connections could hire people to make footage look like whatever they needed it to look like. Maria's eyes met Nancy's. Your husband has both. Hen, we need to find the original footage. Or find the person who altered it. Nancy was already making mental notes, adding this to the growing list of leads. Diane's contact might be able to trace the security company Morton Tech uses. Nancy. Maria's voice was gentle but firm. You understand what you're building here? This isn't just about proving your innocence anymore. You're constructing a case that could bring down your husband's entire empire. Nancy thought about Melvin testifying against her, his face impassive as he called her unstable and dangerous. She thought about Lisa in her penthouse, wearing her life like a stolen coat. She thought about her mother fighting cancer alone because her daughter was imprisoned for a murder she didn't commit, framed by people who valued money over truth. Good, Nancy said, her blue eyes hard as diamonds. I want to watch it burn. Every building he owns, every stock he holds, every dollar in his accounts, I want it all to collapse. And when he's standing in the ashes of everything he destroyed me to protect, I want him to know that I did it. That the wife he sacrificed came back and took everything. Maria smiled, sharp and approving. Then let's build your case properly. Because you only get one shot at this, and if you miss, he buries you forever. That night, Nancy lay awake long after lights out, staring at the ceiling while Maria's soft breathing filled the cell. 4 months ago, she'd been Nancy Morton, respected art curator, wife to a billionaire, living a life of gallery openings and penthouse views. That woman was dead, murdered in a courtroom by lies and planted evidence. The woman who remained was something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. She was Nancy Reynolds, wrongfully convicted but strategically patient, building her case brick by brick, connection by connection, piece of evidence by piece of evidence. She was learning to survive in maximum security, to build alliances, to think like a lawyer and fight like someone with nothing left to lose. Because she had nothing left to lose. Her freedom was gone. Her marriage was revealed as a lie. Her home was occupied by a murderer. Her mother was dying. All that remained was vengeance, precise and devastating. And Nancy was discovering she had a talent for it. She closed her eyes and made herself a promise in the darkness, *I will prove Lisa killed Catherine. I will expose Melvin's corruption. I will walk free while they lose everything. And when his empire collapses, I will feel nothing but satisfaction. The refined art curator was dead. The destroyer was just beginning. 11 months into her sentence, Nancy Reynolds learned that her mother had weeks to live, and the same judge who'd convicted her of murder denied her the chance to say goodbye. The call came through the prison chaplain, Father Michael, his weathered face soft with sympathy as he delivered the news in the small chapel office. Linda Reynolds's breast cancer had metastasized to her liver and bones. The doctors gave her 3 weeks, maybe 4. Nancy's father Alexander had filed an emergency compassionate release petition, begging Judge Anna R. Folk to let his daughter attend her mother's bedside, even if only for a few hours under guard supervision. Judge Folk had denied it within 24 hours. The defendant poses a flight risk given the severity of her crime and the strength of her family support system, the ruling stated in cold legalese. Compassionate release is denied. Nancy read the decision in her cell, Maria sitting silently beside her, and felt something inside her chest crack open. Not break, breaking implied weakness, and Nancy had learned to be hard. But crack, like ice splitting under pressure, revealing the frozen grief beneath 7 months of strategic calculation. I won't see her again, Nancy said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. I won't hold her hand. I won't tell her I love her. I won't be there when she dies, I'm so sorry. Maria's voice was thick with emotion. Nancy, this is cruel beyond measure. It's strategic. Nancy's blue eyes were dry but burning. Judge Folk knows what she's doing. She's reminding me that I have no power here, that the system owns me completely. She folded the denial notice with precise, controlled movements. She made a mistake though. What do you mean? She just gave me clarity. Nancy looked up, and Maria saw something frightening in her expression, grief transformed into cold, absolute purpose. I've been holding back, trying to be strategic, measuring my moves carefully. But my mother is dying while I rot in here for a crime I didn't commit, framed by people who valued money over truth. I'm done being patient. It's time to burn Melvin's empire to the ground. The unraveling had already begun, though Nancy wouldn't learn the full extent until Salmon's visit that Saturday. Her sister arrived with a leather folder stuffed with documents, her eyes red from crying about their mother but sharp with determined focus. Stacy found it, Salmon said, pressing documents against the plexiglass so Nancy could see. Evidence tampering. The security footage from the parking garage where Catherine's body was found, the metadata doesn't match. The timestamp format, the file compression, everything. It was edited, Nancy. Someone doctored that footage to make it look like your car was there. Nancy's heart pounded. Can Stacy prove it? She hired a forensic video analyst, former FBI. He'll testify that the footage was manipulated using professional editing software, the kind that costs $50,000 and requires specialized training. Not something an art curator would have access to, but definitely something a billionaire's private security team would. What else? Nancy could see there was more, could read it in her sister's face. The DNA under Catherine's fingernails, the prosecution's smoking gun. Stacy had it independently analyzed by a forensic expert at Columbia. Nancy, your DNA was there, but it wasn't from skin cells scraped during a struggle. It was from hair follicles and epithelial cells consistent with a sample taken from a hairbrush or pillowcase. Salmon's voice shook with fury. Someone took your DNA from your home and planted it under a dead woman's nails to frame you. Nancy felt ice spread through her veins. She'd known intellectually that she'd been framed, but seeing the scientific proof, understanding the calculated cruelty of it, someone had entered her home, stolen her DNA, and used it to manufacture evidence of murder. Melvin or Lisa or both, moving through her bedroom, touching her things, planning her destruction with methodical precision. There's more, Salmon continued. The federal investigation into Morton Tech went official yesterday. SEC is looking into the Tech Vision acquisition, specifically the timing relative to Catherine's death and whether there was securities fraud involved. 3 major investors have filed lawsuits alleging Melvin concealed material information about the deal. His legal fees alone are going to run millions. Good. Nancy's voice was hard. What about Lisa? Stacy's investigator found something interesting about her background. Remember that ex-boyfriend who supposedly committed suicide 7 years ago? Jumped off his apartment balcony in Chicago? Salmon leaned closer. The responding officers noted inconsistencies at the scene. Defensive wounds on his hands, like he'd fought someone. But the case was closed as suicide anyway after a substantial donation to the police benevolent fund from an anonymous donor. Guess whose consulting firm was based in Chicago at the time? Nancy's breath caught. She's killed before. Stacy thinks so. And if we can prove a pattern, if we can connect Lisa to that death and show she has a history of violence, it strengthens our case that she killed Catherine too. The pieces were falling into place, the architecture of Melvin's empire cracking under the weight of truth. But Nancy felt no satisfaction, only grinding determination mixed with devastating grief. Her mother was dying, and all the evidence-tampering discoveries in the world wouldn't give Nancy back the time she was losing. That night, the prison chaplain arranged for Nancy to make a phone call to her mother's hospice room. Linda Reynolds's voice was weak but clear, and Nancy could hear the morphine slur beneath her words. "My brave girl," Linda whispered. "Don't cry for me. I know you didn't do this terrible thing. I know the truth, and soon everyone else will too. Mama, I'm so sorry." Nancy's voice cracked, 7 months of controlled grief finally breaking through. "I should be there. I should be holding your hand. You're exactly where you need to be," Linda said, and despite the weakness, her voice held steel. "You're fighting. You're surviving. You're going to prove your innocence and make those people pay for what they did. That's what I need from you, Nancy. Not tears. Not guilt. Just the promise that you'll destroy them. I promise." Nancy's tears fell freely now, her face pressed against the phone in the chaplain's office. "I promise I'll make them lose everything, Mama. For you. For me. For Catherine Wu and everyone they've hurt. Good girl." Linda's breathing was labored. "Now listen to me. When I'm gone, when you feel like giving up, remember, you're a Reynolds woman. We don't break. We burn the whole world down if we have to, but we don't break." 3 weeks later, Linda J. Reynolds died with her husband and younger daughter at her bedside, while her eldest daughter received the news through a prison chaplain in a concrete cell 200 miles away. Nancy didn't cry. She'd cried all her tears during that phone call. Instead, she sat on her bunk with Maria's quiet presence beside her and made a vow in the cold silence of cell block C. Melvin Morton had taken her freedom, her reputation, her home, and now her chance to say goodbye to her mother. He would pay for every single loss. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly and completely, watching everything he'd valued more than truth crumble to dust. The empire was already cracking. Federal investigations, investor lawsuits, evidence-tampering discoveries, forensic proof of framing. Salmond reported that Melvin had started drinking heavily, that his hands shook during board meetings, that Lisa was screaming at him constantly, paranoid and vicious. Good. Let him drown in expensive scotch and expensive lies. Let Lisa's paranoia eat her alive from the inside. Let them both feel the walls closing in, the consequences approaching, the careful architecture of their crimes collapsing. Nancy's mother was dead. And the woman who remained, the cold, strategic destroyer forged in 11 months of maximum security, would make absolutely certain that Melvin and Lisa lost everything. Not for justice. Not even for vindication. But for Linda Reynolds, who died believing her daughter would burn the whole world down if she had to. And Nancy would. She absolutely would. 15 months into her sentence, Nancy Reynolds received 3 pieces of information on the same day: proof that Lisa Manfredi was a serial killer, proof that the detective who investigated her case was bought and paid for, and confirmation that her mother's funeral had taken place without her. Stacey E. Williams arrived for their attorney-client meeting with a banker's box full of evidence and eyes blazing with righteous fury. She spread documents across the metal table in the consultation room like cards in a winning hand. "I found him," Stacey said without preamble. Lisa's ex-boyfriend. David Chen, 31 years old, supposed suicide in Chicago 7 years ago. Except it wasn't suicide, Nancy. The responding officers noted defensive wounds on his hands, bruising around his throat, signs of struggle. But the case was closed within 48 hours after a $50,000 donation to the Police Benevolent Fund. Nancy's hands trembled as she picked up the police report, seeing the crime scene photos, reading the note some honest cop had written before being overruled. Who made the donation? Officially? An anonymous donor through a shell company. But I traced it backward through 3 layers of corporate entities. Want to guess who owned the parent company? Stacey's smile was sharp as glass. A venture capital firm where Lisa Manfredi worked as a strategic consultant. The same job title she later held at Morton Tech. She killed him. Nancy's voice was flat, stating fact. She killed her ex-boyfriend and bought her way out of consequences. Then she did it again with Catherine Wu. There's more. Stacey pulled out another document, this one a forensic accounting report. Detective Morrison, the lead investigator on your case, the one who found all that convenient evidence and ignored every inconsistency. His bank records show deposits totaling $75,000 in the 3 months after Catherine's murder. The money came from a consulting fee paid by Morton Tech for security analysis services. Nancy felt cold rage settle in her chest, crystalline and sharp. Melvin paid him to railroad me. He paid him to ignore evidence that didn't fit the narrative and highlight evidence that did. Morrison knew about the timeline problems, knew about the doctored security footage, knew your DNA evidence was suspicious. He buried it all. Stacy's voice shook with controlled anger. Nancy, we have him. We have Morrison, we have the evidence tampering, we have Lisa's pattern of violence. I'm filing an emergency appeal today. What about Lisa at the murder scene? Nancy forced herself to focus, to think strategically even as grief and rage threatened to overwhelm her. Can you place her there? Stacy's smile widened. The hotel where Catherine Wu was last seen alive, the prosecution claimed you met her there despite you having alibi witnesses across town. I had our investigator pull every piece of security footage from that night, not just the parking garage but the lobby, elevators, hallways, everything. She pushed forward a USB drive. Lisa Manfredi entered that hotel at 8:47 p.m. She went to the 7th floor, the same floor where Catherine was staying. She left at 10:23 p.m., wearing different clothes than when she arrived, carrying a large tote bag she didn't have before. Nancy stared at the USB drive, seeing her vindication contained in digital files. The prosecution said I was there. The prosecution lied. You were at a gallery opening with 50 witnesses and time-stamped photos. Lisa was at the murder scene, caught on camera, during the exact window when Catherine died. Stacy's voice was triumphant. We reconstructed Catherine's last day completely. She had a 9 p.m. meeting scheduled with someone named L. Manfredi in the hotel business center. She texted her wife at 8:52 p.m. saying she was heading to the meeting. She never texted again. Lisa strangled her during that meeting. Nancy's voice was steady, but her hands gripped the table edge until her knuckles whitened. Probably told her it was about the Tech Vision deal, about changing Catherine's vote. And when Catherine refused, Lisa killed her. Then used your stolen access card to move the body, planted your DNA, and called Melvin to help dispose of the evidence in your car. Stacy laid out the timeline like a prosecutor building a case. Nancy, we have her. Video evidence, timeline reconstruction, pattern of previous violence, financial motive, means, and opportunity. I'm filing the emergency appeal with all of this. The conviction won't survive scrutiny. Nancy should have felt triumph. This was what she'd worked toward for 15 months, proof of her innocence, proof of their guilt, the evidence that would set her free and destroy them. But all she felt was a yawning emptiness where her mother should have been. When? Nancy asked quietly. When did they bury her? Stacy's expression softened with sympathy. Yesterday. Your father delayed as long as he could, hoping for compassionate release, but Judge Folk denied it. Nancy's voice was hollow. So they buried my mother without me. I didn't get to see her. I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to stand at her grave and tell her I loved her. Nancy, no. Nancy stood abruptly, pacing the small consultation room like a caged animal. Do you know what the last thing my mother said to me was? 3 weeks ago, when I called her hospice room, when she could barely breathe, barely speak. She said, destroy them, Nancy. Make them lose everything. That was my mother's dying wish. Not peace. Not forgiveness. Vengeance. She turned to face Stacy, and the attorney actually took a step back from the cold fury in Nancy's blue eyes. I made her a promise, Nancy continued, her voice like ice over deep water. I promised I would burn Melvin's empire to the ground. I promised I would make Lisa pay for every life she's destroyed. And I keep my promises, Stacy. Especially to my dead mother. The appeal will take time, Stacy warned. Even with all this evidence, the system moves slowly. Could be months before we get a hearing. I have nothing but time. Nancy sat back down, her grief transmuting into cold, absolute determination. File the appeal. Send copies to every journalist who covered my trial. Leak the security footage of Lisa at the murder scene. Let the federal investigators know about Morrison's payments. Let Melvin watch his empire crumble while he waits for the other shoe to drop. Stacy nodded slowly. Nancy, when you get out, and you will get out, what are you going to do? Nancy thought about her mother's funeral, the grave she hadn't been allowed to visit. She thought about 15 months in maximum security for a murder she didn't commit. She thought about Lisa wearing her clothes, sleeping in her bed, living her stolen life while Nancy's mother died alone. She thought about Melvin's testimony, calling her unstable and dangerous, sacrificing her to protect his killer mistress and his precious empire. I'm going to rebuild my life, Nancy said quietly. I'm going to visit my mother's grave. I'm going to reclaim everything they took from me. And then I'm going to watch, with complete indifference, as Melvin and Lisa lose everything, their freedom, their fortune, their future. Because the best revenge isn't making them suffer. It's living extraordinarily well while they rot in the same system that tried to destroy me. But that was the version Nancy told Stacy, the one that sounded measured and mature. The truth, the promise she'd made to her dying mother, was darker and more absolute: that I will destroy them completely. I will take everything, their money, their freedom, their reputations, their hope. And when Melvin comes to me broken and desperate, I will give him nothing. Not mercy. Not forgiveness. Not even acknowledgement. Just cold indifference, the kind he showed me in that courtroom when he lied under oath and sent me to prison. That night, back in cell block C, Maria found Nancy sitting on her bunk with a single photograph, the last picture of her mother, taken by Salmon 2 months ago. Linda Reynolds looked frail but fierce, her eyes holding the same determination Nancy had inherited. I'm sorry, Maria said simply, because there were no other words. Don't be. Nancy's voice was steady. My mother lived long enough to know I'd win. She died knowing Lisa and Melvin would pay. That's more than most people get. What happens when the appeal succeeds? Maria asked carefully. When you walk out of here free. Nancy looked at the photograph for a long moment, then set it gently aside. Then the real work begins. Because prison was just the intermission. The final act, the one where the empire falls and the guilty face justice, that happens when I'm free to orchestrate it personally. She looked up at Maria, and her cellmate saw what 15 months of wrongful imprisonment had forged: not a victim, not even a survivor, but something harder and more dangerous. A woman who'd lost everything and discovered she was capable of anything. Stacy filed the appeal today, Nancy said. All the evidence, Lisa at the murder scene, Morrison's payments, the planted DNA, everything. It's just a matter of time now. And then? Nancy's smile was cold and absolutely certain. And then Melvin Morton and Lisa Manfredi learn what it costs to frame an innocent woman for murder. They took 15 months of my life, my career, my reputation, and my chance to say goodbye to my mother. I'm going to take everything they have left. Outside, rain began to fall against the prison windows, a sound like time counting down. Somewhere in Manhattan, Melvin was drinking expensive scotch and watching his stock prices fall. Somewhere in Nancy's stolen penthouse, Lisa was pacing and paranoid, feeling walls close in. Somewhere in a cemetery, Linda Reynolds rested in the ground her eldest daughter hadn't been allowed to visit. And in cell block C, Nancy Reynolds sat with cold determination and mounting evidence, counting the days until her vindication and their destruction. The revelation was complete. The evidence was compiled. The appeal was filed. Now came the reckoning. 18 months after Nancy Reynolds heard the word guilty, she heard a different word that changed everything: overturned. Judge Anna Folk's face was rigid with barely concealed fury as she read the appellate court's decision in the emergency hearing. The evidence of tampering was overwhelming, the pattern of corruption undeniable, the wrongful conviction so egregious that 3 appellate judges had unanimously ordered Nancy's immediate release. Folk had no choice but to comply, her voice clipped and cold as she declared Nancy Reynolds a free woman, effective immediately. Nancy stood in the courtroom wearing the same charcoal Armani dress she'd been convicted in 18 months ago, retrieved from evidence storage and now hanging loose on her leaner, harder frame. She felt Maria's presence in the gallery behind her, her father Alexander's quiet sobs of relief, Salmon's fierce grip on the railing. But mostly she felt empty, hollowed out by 18 months of maximum security and a mother's grave she still hadn't visited. Stacy E. Williams was crying openly, gripping Nancy's hand. You're free. Nancy, you're free. But freedom felt strange and disorienting, like stepping into bright sunlight after months in darkness. Nancy walked out of the courtroom in a daze, barely processing the media frenzy erupting outside, the cameras flashing, the reporters shouting questions. All she could think was that she should call her mother, should tell Linda the good news, before remembering with fresh grief that her mother was 3 weeks dead and buried without her. The real chaos was happening elsewhere. Nancy didn't learn the full extent until hours later, sitting in her father's study with Salman and Stacy, watching the news coverage unfold like a controlled demolition. At 2:47 p.m., exactly 17 minutes after Nancy's conviction was overturned, federal agents arrested Lisa Manfredi at the penthouse, Nancy's penthouse, on charges of first-degree murder in the death of Catherine Wu. The footage played on every news channel, Lisa in handcuffs, her carefully composed face finally cracking, screaming that it was a mistake, that they had the wrong person, that Nancy had somehow orchestrated this from prison. She wasn't entirely wrong about the last part. At 3:15 p.m., the U.S. Attorney's Office announced federal conspiracy charges against Melvin Morton, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder, securities fraud, and witness tampering. The evidence was devastating. Detective Morrison had flipped, providing testimony about the $75,000 in payments and Melvin's direct instructions to bury exculpatory evidence. Melvin's own security team, facing their own charges, had confirmed they'd doctored security footage and planted evidence on his orders. At 3:32 p.m., Morton Tech stock began to crash. By market close at 4 p.m., it had dropped 94%, wiping out $2.1 billion in value. Melvin's personal net worth evaporated in hours, from billionaire to effectively bankrupt as assets were frozen, accounts seized, investors fled, and lawsuits multiplied. At 5:47 p.m., Morton Tech's board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Melvin Morton as CEO, effective immediately. Nancy watched it all unfold from her father's leather couch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm afternoon, feeling like she was watching events happen to someone else. The empire Melvin had sacrificed her to protect was collapsing in real time, and she felt nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where 18 months of her life used to be. Nancy. Salman's voice was gentle. How are you feeling? I don't know. Nancy's voice sounded strange to her own ears after 18 months of strategic hardness. I thought I'd feel victorious. I thought watching them lose everything would heal something. But Mama's still dead, and I still lost 18 months, and nothing can give that back. Her father Alexander crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, and Nancy finally let herself cry. Not for Melvin or Lisa or even for justice. But for her mother, who'd died believing her daughter was a murderer, who'd never gotten to see this vindication, who'd been buried in the ground while Nancy rotted in a cell for a crime she didn't commit. The next morning, Nancy stood at her mother's grave for the first time, watching workers prepare to reopen it temporarily for a private family ceremony. Stacy had arranged it, a chance for Nancy to finally say goodbye properly, to place flowers on the casket, to speak the words she'd been denied 18 months ago. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind through autumn leaves. Nancy knelt beside the grave, her hands shaking as she laid white roses, her mother's favorite, on the fresh earth. I kept my promise, Mama, Nancy whispered. I destroyed them. Melvin lost everything, his company, his fortune, his freedom. Lisa's facing life in prison for Catherine's murder. It all collapsed yesterday, just like you said it would. I hope wherever you are, you know. I hope you saw. She stayed there for an hour, talking to her mother, crying the tears she'd held back in prison, letting herself grieve properly for the first time since that devastating phone call 15 months ago. When she finally stood, her knees stiff from kneeling, her face felt lighter somehow, the crushing weight of grief shifted if not lifted. The private ceremony began at noon, just Nancy, Alexander, and Salman. A minister spoke words about faith and justice and a mother's love. They played Linda's favorite hymn. Nancy read a letter she'd written in prison, words about survival and vengeance and love, about becoming someone strong enough to carry her mother's fierce spirit forward. And then, impossibly, she saw Melvin. He stood at the edge of the cemetery, 50 yards away but unmistakable in his rumpled suit, his face haggard and aged beyond his 47 years. He'd come to what? Apologize? Explain? Beg forgiveness? Nancy felt her father tense beside her, felt Salman's hand grip her arm. "I'll handle this," Alexander said, his voice colder than Nancy had ever heard it. Her father, the distinguished professor who'd never raised his voice, walked toward Melvin with purpose in every step. Nancy couldn't hear the words exchanged, but she saw her father's finger pointing, saw Melvin's shoulders slump, saw 2 cemetery security guards appear and escort him away. When Alexander returned, his expression was granite. "He's gone. He won't bother you again." Nancy nodded, feeling nothing. Melvin was irrelevant now, a broken man facing decades in prison, his empire ash, his mistress arrested, his carefully constructed life completely destroyed. Nancy had won. She'd kept her promise to her mother. Justice had prevailed. So why did she still feel so empty, that evening, back at her father's house? Because the penthouse was a crime scene and Nancy wouldn't have returned there anyway. She watched the news coverage continue. Lisa's arraignment, Melvin's perp walk, Morton Tech declaring bankruptcy, investors filing lawsuits, federal prosecutors outlining their case. The story dominated every channel. Wrongfully convicted art curator exonerated while billionaire husband and killer mistress face justice. Nancy's phone rang constantly. Journalists requesting interviews, former friends offering support, colleagues expressing outrage, strangers sending messages of solidarity. She ignored them all, sitting in the quiet darkness of her childhood bedroom, feeling the strange dissonance of freedom. 18 months ago, she'd been convicted in a courtroom, her life destroyed in the space between one gavel strike and the next. Yesterday, she'd been freed in a courtroom, her vindication delivered with the same mechanical efficiency. But neither moment, conviction or exoneration, had prepared her for the aftermath. She was free. They were destroyed. Justice had been served. And Nancy Reynolds, sitting in the darkness with her mother's funeral flowers still fresh on her hands, felt nothing but the hollow certainty that revenge, no matter how complete, couldn't undo the damage or resurrect the dead. But it was something. And for now, something was all she had. 8 months after walking out of prison, Nancy Reynolds discovered that freedom was more complicated than vindication, and healing required more courage than survival ever had. The panic attack started 3 weeks after her release. Nancy would be walking through a supermarket or standing in line at a coffee shop, and suddenly the walls would close in, her chest would tighten, and she'd be back in cell block C with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and metal doors clanging shut. She'd find herself gasping for air in public spaces, her hands shaking, her heart racing, unable to distinguish between Manhattan sidewalks and maximum security corridors. Dr. Rachel Kim, the trauma specialist Stacy had recommended, explained it gently during their twice-weekly sessions. Your nervous system spent 18 months in survival mode. It doesn't know how to relax yet. It's waiting for the next threat, the next betrayal, the next loss. PTSD doesn't care that you're free now. It only knows what happened. Nancy sat in Dr. Kim's comfortable office with its soft lighting and abstract art, so different from prison's harsh reality, and learned to breathe through panic, to ground herself in the present, to distinguish between genuine danger and trauma-triggered fear. It was slow, exhausting work, like learning to walk again after a devastating injury. But Nancy was nothing if not determined. The woman who'd survived 18 months wrongfully imprisoned, who'd built a case from inside a cell, who'd kept her promise to a dying mother, that woman could survive panic attacks and flashbacks too. 6 months after her release, Nancy founded the Justice Reclaimed Foundation from a small office in Brooklyn, funded by her father's support and donations from people outraged by her story. The mission was simple: help the wrongfully convicted prove their innocence, provide legal resources, support families navigating the appeals process, advocate for criminal justice reform. It gave her purpose beyond healing, beyond the hollow satisfaction of watching her enemies face consequences. Every case file on her desk was another Nancy Reynolds, another innocent person destroyed by corrupted systems, planted evidence, bought testimony, prosecutorial misconduct. And now Nancy had the resources, the connections, and the lived experience to help them fight back. She met Marcus Chin at a Justice Reclaimed fundraiser, though she'd known his byline for months. He was the investigative journalist who'd covered her exoneration with meticulous detail, who'd exposed Detective Morrison's corruption, who'd written devastating profiles of Judge Folk's pattern of conviction-focused rulings. He was 42, with intelligent eyes and a quiet intensity that reminded Nancy of someone who'd seen too much injustice to look away. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, approaching her after her speech to donors. "I wanted to tell you, what you're building here, it matters. I've covered wrongful convictions for 15 years, and most exonerated people disappear, try to rebuild privately. But you're fighting for others. That's rare. Nancy studied him carefully, her prison-honed instincts reading his sincerity, finding it genuine. Someone has to. The system that destroyed me is destroying others every day. I can't fix it alone, but I can try. They talked for an hour that night, about corruption and justice and the grinding cruelty of wrongful imprisonment. Marcus listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely cared, who wasn't just mining for a story. When he asked if she'd consider letting him write a long-form piece about Justice Reclaim's work, Nancy surprised herself by saying yes. The friendship developed slowly over the following months. Marcus would stop by the foundation office with coffee, would attend support group meetings Nancy facilitated for exonerated individuals, would share his investigative findings on cases Justice Reclaimed was working. He never pushed, never demanded more than Nancy was ready to give, seemed to understand that trust was something she'd need to rebuild piece by careful piece. Meanwhile, the trials unfolded with grinding inevitability. Melvin's trial began in January, 8 months after Nancy's release. She watched from the gallery as prosecutors outlined his crimes, the evidence tampering, the payments to Detective Morrison, the conspiracy to frame his innocent wife to protect his killer mistress and his $500 million acquisition deal. Melvin sat at the defense table looking gaunt and hollow, his expensive suits replaced by cheaper versions, his legal team underfunded now that his assets were frozen and his fortune evaporated. Lisa had abandoned him the moment the money disappeared, her attorney making clear she bore no loyalty to a disgraced, bankrupt co-conspirator. Melvin faced the consequences alone, without the mistress he'd sacrificed everything to protect. Nancy testified for 3 hours, describing the framing, the planted evidence, the 18 months in maximum security, her mother's death. She kept her voice steady, her blue eyes locked on Melvin's face, watching him flinch with every word. When the prosecutor asked how it felt to be betrayed by her husband of 14 years, Nancy's answer was simple and devastating: it felt like dying. And then it felt like being reborn into someone who would never make the mistake of trusting a man who valued money over truth. Melvin was convicted on all counts. 23 years in federal prison. Lisa's trial was faster, the evidence overwhelming. Security footage placing her at the murder scene, Catherine Wu's blood on clothes recovered from Lisa's storage unit, forensic evidence of the struggle, financial motive documented in emails and contracts, pattern of violence established through David Chen's suspicious suicide. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty of first-degree murder. Life without parole. Nancy testified at that trial too, describing how Lisa had worn her clothes, slept in her bed, lived her stolen life while Nancy rotted in prison for Lisa's crime. She watched Lisa's face crumble when the verdict was read, watched the beautiful, calculating killer led away in chains to the same system she'd helped use to destroy Nancy. Justice had been served. The guilty were imprisoned. Nancy's vindication was complete. But sitting in Dr. Kim's office the week after Lisa's sentencing, Nancy admitted the truth she'd been avoiding: I don't feel satisfied. I thought watching them lose everything would heal something, but it didn't. They're in prison, and I'm free, and my mother is still dead. 18 months are still gone. I still have panic attacks in grocery stores. The victory feels hollow. Dr. Kim nodded with understanding. Because revenge isn't healing. It's justice, and justice matters, but it doesn't undo trauma. Healing requires something different: rebuilding your life, finding purpose beyond destruction, learning to trust again despite betrayal. That's harder than vengeance. Learning to trust again. Nancy thought about Marcus, who'd been patient and kind, who'd never pushed for more than she could give, who seemed content to simply exist in her orbit without demanding access to the broken places she was still mending. She invited him to coffee the next day, her hands shaking slightly as she texted the invitation. It wasn't a date, not yet. But it was something more than professional friendship, a tentative step toward allowing someone into the careful fortress she'd built around her damaged heart. They met at a quiet cafe in Fort Greene, away from Manhattan's crowds that still triggered Nancy's PTSD. Marcus arrived with that gentle smile, his presence somehow both calming and energizing. "Thank you for meeting me," Nancy said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup for warmth and comfort. "I wanted to ask, and you can absolutely say no, but would you be interested in dinner sometime? Not as a journalist. Just as, you." Marcus's expression softened with something Nancy recognized as carefully restrained hope. I would love that. Though I should tell you, I've been hoping you'd ask for months. I didn't want to push, didn't want to take advantage of. I know. Nancy smiled, and it felt real for the first time in months. That's why I'm asking. Because you've been patient when I needed patience, present without being demanding, kind without expecting anything in return. That matters, Marcus. Especially to someone who, her voice caught slightly. To someone who's learning to trust again. Their first date was a week later, dinner at a small Italian restaurant Marcus knew, quiet and intimate without being overwhelming. They talked for 3 hours, about her foundation work, his investigations, their shared fury at injustice, their hopes for systemic change. Marcus told stories about growing up in Seattle with journalist parents, about choosing this career path to hold power accountable. Nancy talked about her mother, about the woman she'd been before prison and the woman she was becoming after that. I'm not who I was, Nancy admitted over tiramisu they were sharing. The art curator who believed in beauty and trusted easily, she's gone. I'm harder now, more suspicious, more aware of how easily truth can be destroyed by money and manipulation. That's not weakness, Marcus said gently. That's wisdom earned through suffering. You're still you, Nancy. Just a version who knows how cruel the world can be and chooses to fight that cruelty anyway. When he walked her to her father's house where she was still living, unable to face finding her own apartment yet, Marcus paused at the door. Thank you for tonight, he said. For trusting me enough to try this. Nancy surprised herself by reaching for his hand, intertwining their fingers. Thank you for being worth the risk. She didn't invite him in, that would come later, much later, after more time and healing and carefully rebuilt trust. But standing on her father's porch with Marcus's hand warm in hers, Nancy felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, hope. Not the grim, determined hope of survival or the cold satisfaction of vengeance achieved. But softer hope, the kind that whispered maybe she could build something new from the ashes of her destroyed life. Maybe she could love again, trust again, believe in beauty again, just more carefully, more wisely, with eyes wide open to the possibility of betrayal but choosing connection anyway. The woman who rebuilt was harder than the woman who'd been destroyed. But she was also braver, fiercer, more determined to live extraordinarily well despite everything she'd lost. And as Nancy stood in the autumn evening with Marcus's hand in hers and the justice-reclaimed foundation thriving and her mother's fierce spirit living on through her work, she realized something fundamental. Melvin and Lisa had taken 18 months of her life, but they hadn't taken her capacity for hope, for purpose, for choosing light despite darkness. That victory, the victory of rebuilding, of healing, of daring to trust again, was sweeter than any revenge could ever be. 18 months after her release, Nancy Reynolds was standing in the Justice Reclaimed Foundation office reviewing case files when her assistant Jen appeared in the doorway, her expression uncertain. There's someone here to see you, Jen said carefully. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. His name is Melvin Morton. Nancy's hand stilled on the file she'd been reading. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, her nervous system flooding with the trauma response Dr. Kim had taught her to recognize and manage. But then the panic receded, replaced by something colder and clearer, curiosity mixed with absolute indifference. Send him in, Nancy said quietly. But stay nearby. And leave the door open. Melvin looked like a ghost of the man who testified against her 3 years ago. He was gaunt, his expensive suit replaced by an ill-fitting department store version, his face deeply lined and aged beyond his 49 years. His hands shook slightly as he stood in her doorway, and Nancy could see the desperate hope in his eyes, the plea for mercy or understanding or forgiveness. She felt nothing. Nancy, he began, his voice hoarse. Thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to. You don't, Nancy interrupted, her voice calm and factual. But I'm curious what brings you here. Shouldn't you be preparing for prison? I heard your appeals were exhausted. Melvin flinched. 23 years. I report next week. He took a tentative step into the office, and Nancy didn't move, didn't invite him to sit, didn't soften her expression. I wanted to see you before then. To tell you, to confess, properly, without lawyers or courtrooms. Or you want absolution, Nancy said flatly. You want me to forgive you, to tell you that you're not the monster everyone says you are, to make your conscience easier before you spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. No. I mean, Melvin's composure cracked. I wanted you to know the truth. All of it. Lisa killed Catherine, and I knew within hours. She called me, panicked, and I made a choice. I chose to protect her, to protect the deal, to protect everything I'd built. And I chose to sacrifice you. I know, Nancy said simply. The federal prosecutors laid it all out. You paid Detective Morrison $75,000. Your security team planted my DNA, doctored footage, stole my access card. You testified that I was unstable, jealous, capable of violence. You stood in that courtroom and destroyed me to save your empire and your mistress. Melvin's face crumpled. Everything collapsed. The company's bankrupt. The board voted me out. Every asset seized, every investment worthless. I have nothing, Nancy. Lisa left me the moment the money disappeared. She wouldn't even take my calls from jail. 14 years of marriage, 2 years with her, and in the end, I'm completely alone. Nancy leaned against her desk, arms crossed, studying him with the clinical detachment she'd developed in prison. This broken man had once been everything to her, husband, partner, the person she trusted most in the world. Now he was just a cautionary tale, a reminder of how thoroughly money could corrupt someone's soul. You're telling me this because you want me to feel sorry for you, Nancy said. You want me to say that losing everything was punishment enough, that you've suffered too, that we're somehow equal in our pain. No, but here's what you don't understand, Melvin. Nancy's voice remained steady, empty of emotion. You lost money and status and freedom. I lost 18 months of my life in maximum security for a murder I didn't commit. I lost my mother's final days because Judge Folk denied compassionate release. I lost the ability to walk through a grocery store without panic attacks. I lost the woman I was, the one who believed in you, who trusted you, who thought our marriage meant something more than a business arrangement you'd sacrifice when convenient. Melvin was crying now, silent tears tracking down his haggard face. I know. God, Nancy, I know what I took from you. I destroyed you. I destroyed us. And for what? A deal that collapsed anyway, a woman who never loved me, an empire that was built on corruption and crumbled the moment truth touched it. So why are you here? Nancy asked, her voice almost gentle now, the gentleness of complete indifference. What do you want from me? I don't know, Melvin admitted, his voice breaking. Maybe I wanted to see if you'd become like me, bitter and broken and destroyed. Or maybe I wanted to see if you'd found something I never could. Looking at you now, in this office, helping people, rebuilding lives the system destroyed, I think I have my answer. Nancy nodded slowly. You're irrelevant to me now, Melvin. You're not my husband anymore. You're not even my enemy. You're just a man who made terrible choices and is facing the consequences. I don't hate you. I don't forgive you. I simply don't feel anything about you at all. Don't you feel anything? The question came out desperate, pleading. After everything we were, everything we had, doesn't some part of you still feel something? Nancy finished for him. She considered the question honestly, searching her heart for any remnant of the love she'd once felt for this man. I feel free. That's all. Free from the woman who was naive enough to believe your lies, free from the prison you put me in, free from the burden of hating you. You took 18 months of my life, but you didn't take my ability to rebuild. And that's the part you'll never understand. I won, Melvin. Not because you're going to prison or because your empire collapsed. But because I became someone stronger, someone purposeful, someone who chose to build rather than destroy. Melvin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I wrote you a letter. Everything I should have said, everything his hand trembled as he held it out. Nancy took it, their fingers not quite touching, and walked to the small paper shredder beside her desk. She fed the envelope through without opening it, watching the mechanical teeth destroy whatever confession or plea or apology it contained. I don't need your words, she said, meeting his shocked gaze. I don't need your explanations or your guilt or your regrets. They won't give me back my mother. They won't erase the nightmares or the panic attacks or the 18 months in cell block C. Your suffering doesn't heal mine, Melvin. It just is. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two people who'd once shared everything now separated by an unbridgeable chasm of betrayal and consequence. Nancy could see Melvin searching her face for something: anger, pain, residual love, and finding only calm, steady indifference. "I should go," Melvin finally said, his voice hollow. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm so sorry." "I know you are," Nancy replied. "But sorry doesn't change anything. It never did." She watched him leave, his shoulders bowed, his steps uncertain, a broken man heading toward 23 years in the system he'd once manipulated to destroy her. When the door closed behind him, Nancy returned to her desk and picked up the case file she'd been reviewing: a woman in Ohio, wrongfully convicted on planted evidence, 3 years into a 15-year sentence. Jen appeared in the doorway. "Are you okay?" Nancy looked up, and realized she was smiling slightly. "I'm fine. Actually, I'm better than fine. I thought seeing him would hurt, or trigger something, or make me angry. But it didn't. He's just nothing to me now." "That's growth," Jen said softly. Nancy nodded, returning to the case file. But her hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline of confrontation still coursing through her system. When Jen left, Nancy allowed herself a moment to breathe, to process, to acknowledge that indifference, while true, had still cost something to achieve. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus, * dinner tonight?" "I'm cooking, * Nancy smiled, typing back, * perfect. "I have something to tell you, * that evening, in Marcus's warm apartment that had become a second home over the past year, Nancy told him about Melvin's visit while they cooked pasta together. Marcus listened without interrupting, his steady presence grounding her, his hand occasionally reaching out to touch her arm or her back, small reassurances that she wasn't alone in processing this. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked when she finished, stirring the sauce. "Lighter," Nancy admitted. "I thought there'd be this big dramatic confrontation, that I'd deliver some devastating speech that would destroy him further. But seeing him already destroyed, already broken, there was nothing left to say. He's facing his consequences. I'm living my life. That's justice enough." Marcus pulled her into his arms, and Nancy let herself sink into the embrace, feeling the solid warmth of someone who chose her every day, who knew her trauma and loved her anyway, who'd been patient while she learned to trust again. "That I'm proud of you," Marcus murmured into her hair. "For not letting him take any more of your peace." Nancy pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. "He took enough. 18 months, my mother, my innocence. But he didn't take my future. That's mine. Ours, if you want it." "I want it," Marcus said softly, and kissed her with the gentle intensity that still made her heart race even after a year together. Later, lying in Marcus's bed with his arm around her and the city lights filtering through the windows, Nancy thought about Melvin in his empty apartment preparing for prison, Lisa in her cell serving life without parole, the empire that had collapsed overnight, the justice that had been served. And she thought about her mother, whose fierce spirit had sustained her through the darkest days, whose death had fueled her transformation from victim to advocate, whose absence still ached like a physical wound. "I kept my promise, Mama," Nancy whispered into the darkness. "They lost everything. And I found something better than revenge. I found purpose, and love, and peace." Marcus's arm tightened around her. "Talking to your mom?" "Always," Nancy said. "She'd like you, I think. She'd like who I've become." "I like who you've become too," Marcus said. "All of her, the parts that survived, the parts that rebuilt, the parts still healing." Nancy closed her eyes, feeling something she'd thought was lost forever in that courtroom 3 years ago: contentment. Not happiness, that would come later, in moments and days and years of choosing life despite trauma. But contentment, the deep knowledge that she'd survived the worst and emerged not just intact but stronger. Melvin Morton would spend the next 23 years in federal prison, his empire destroyed, his fortune evaporated, his legacy one of corruption and betrayal. Lisa Manfredi would spend the rest of her life behind bars for murder. And Nancy Reynolds would spend her future helping the wrongfully convicted, loving a good man, building something meaningful from the ashes of her destroyed life. She'd won. Not through their destruction, though that was satisfying in its way. But through her own reconstruction, her choice to become something more than what they tried to reduce her to. That was the reckoning, not Melvin's broken apology or Lisa's life sentence, but Nancy's absolute indifference to both. They'd taken her past. But her future was entirely, triumphantly her own. 2 years after walking out of prison, Nancy Reynolds stood on the stage of the Justice Reclaimed Foundation Gala in a midnight blue gown that caught the light like water, addressing 500 people who'd raised $3.2 million in a single evening. Her voice was steady, her blue eyes bright with purpose rather than pain, as she described the foundation's work freeing 17 wrongfully convicted individuals in the past year alone. Marcus watched from the front table, his expression radiating quiet pride. The ring he proposed with 3 weeks ago, a simple sapphire that matched her eyes, caught the spotlight as Nancy gestured, emphasizing a point about systemic reform. She'd said yes without hesitation, standing in his apartment after they'd watched her TED Talk surpass 10 million views, her voice certain, yes. 1,000 times yes. The TED Talk had changed everything. Nancy's 18-minute speech on wrongful convictions, delivered with unflinching honesty about her own experience, had gone viral within days. Publishers competed for her book deal. The Whitney Museum called about curating a major exhibition. Interview requests flooded in from every major network. Nancy Reynolds, once destroyed by a corrupt system, had become the voice of everyone it had failed. Her book, Framed, When Truth Costs Everything, would publish in the spring. The Whitney exhibition, a collection exploring justice, truth, and American institutional failure through contemporary art, would open in 2 months. She'd returned to the career she'd loved, but transformed, wielding her curator's eye now toward work that challenged and questioned rather than merely beautified. Meanwhile, the final pieces of Melvin and Lisa's destruction had fallen into place with bureaucratic inevitability. Melvin's appeals exhausted, sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Lisa serving life without parole, her beautiful face aging behind bars in the same system that had nearly destroyed Nancy. Morton Tech declared bankruptcy, the empire completely dissolved, billions evaporated, employees scattered, the headquarters building sold to settle lawsuits. Nancy felt nothing about any of it. They were simply news items now, distant and irrelevant to the extraordinary life she was building. The exhibition opening at the Whitney arrived on a crisp October evening, the kind of night Nancy had once dreamed about in prison, sophisticated crowds, champagne, art illuminated perfectly, her name on the wall as curator. She wore an elegant black gown, her dark hair swept up, Marcus handsome beside her in his tuxedo. They moved through the galleries together, Nancy explaining her curatorial choices to collectors and critics, Marcus's hand a steady presence at the small of her back. "You're brilliant," he murmured during a quiet moment between conversations. "Watching you tonight, this is who you were always meant to be." Nancy smiled, squeezing his hand. "No. This is who I became. There's a difference." Her father Alexander arrived with Salmond, both beaming with pride. They stood together before a particularly powerful piece, a mixed-media work exploring wrongful conviction through portraiture and legal documents, and Nancy felt her mother's absence as sharply as ever, wishing Linda could have seen this triumph, this vindication, this proof that Nancy Reynolds hadn't just survived but soared. In a federal prison 300 miles away, Melvin Morton sat in his cell watching news coverage of the Whitney opening on a shared television. The camera panned across Nancy's face, those piercing blue eyes now fierce with purpose and peace rather than haunted by trauma, and lingered on her hand intertwined with Marcus's, the sapphire engagement ring visible even on grainy prison TV. The reporter's voice described Nancy's remarkable transformation: exonerated curator becomes justice advocate, TED Talk sensation, best-selling author, celebrated exhibition curator, engaged to Pulitzer-nominated journalist. The woman Melvin had tried to destroy had become extraordinary, while he rotted in a cell facing 2 decades of consequences. He'd lost everything: fortune, freedom, legacy, the woman he'd sacrificed his wife to protect. And Nancy Reynolds, the woman whose life he'd stolen 18 months from, had won so completely that his destruction was merely a footnote to her triumph. Back at the Whitney, Nancy stood before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, the city glittering below like scattered diamonds. Marcus joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching their reflection in the glass. "Happy?" Marcus asked softly. Nancy considered the question honestly, thinking about the journey from that devastating guilty verdict to this moment of complete restoration. "Not happy," she said finally. "Happiness feels too simple for what this is. I'm whole. Despite everything they took, despite everything I lost, I'm whole again. Different, harder, wiser. But whole. That's better than happiness," Marcus said, kissing her temple. "That's victory." Nancy turned in his arms, her blue eyes meeting his with the clarity that came from surviving the unsurvivable and choosing to build rather than destroy. I won, she said simply. Not because they lost everything, though they did. But because I became someone extraordinary despite them. That's the part they'll never understand, they made me stronger. Around them, the exhibition thrived with conversation and champagne and appreciation for art that challenged and questioned and demanded truth. Nancy Reynolds, once wrongfully convicted and nearly destroyed, now stood at the center of it all, curator, advocate, survivor, fighter, lover, future wife. The woman who'd heard guilty in that courtroom 3 years ago had died. But the woman who rose from those ashes had learned to soar, fierce and purposeful and absolutely free. And that woman, standing in the Whitney Museum with her fiancé's arms around her and her mother's spirit blessing her and her future stretching bright and limitless ahead, had won everything that mattered.